is impossible and it's wrong. What evidence does intelligent design have for like our current fossils? Like say, for example, the humanoid like fossils that only appeared like a few million years ago?
Thank you for asking that. I think that there's a lot of confusion about the fossil record. There is the allegation that it has no gaps. There was a conference in 1980 in Chicago entitled the Chicago Conference on Macroevolution. And if you know what, we do need to switch the, keep switching that back and forth. So the prediction was that the prediction by Darwin was that the fossil record would flesh out, and eventually when we found a lot of fossils, it would look like this. But what Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard pointed out is that, sorry, biologists, the paleontologists have found that there's this explosion called the Cambrian explosion, and that the phyla have suddenly appeared and they stayed the same, in complete contradiction to what the expectations were, the predictions from Darwinism. So, I mean, there are similarities among them, but the big picture is that Stephen Jay Gould asked to say, we got to find some new mechanisms that would explain the sudden appearance of the phyla, and none were found. So they just figured, well, we're committed to this philosophy of naturalism, and so we're just going to assume that natural selection and random variation would explain the gaping holes in the streams of the fossil record called the phyla. Now, I think, does Mr. Erdmann have an opportunity to respond to that if he wants to?
Would you like to respond, Mr. Erdmann?
Why, yes, I would.
Yes.
Can we get the screen put back up? So one argument I wasn't able to present tonight due to limited time was the mathematical argument. And one thing I find really convincing is that it appears that evolutionary change proceeds according to chaos math. And we can get into that a little bit later if people have questions about that. Visual representations of chaos math are fractals, which you may have learned about in geometry. So what may have happened in the Cambrian explosion, and at this point it really is conjecture. Both Mr. Royce and I are really just kind of offering up some hypotheses. The so-called major differences that we see emerged initially as minor differences. There may have been some unknown disturbances or disruptions that disrupted the stability of the system, wherever that was located, that led to a very minor difference. A worm with no rod down the back versus a worm with a rod down the back. And then over evolutionary time, that gave rise to the major distinguishing characteristics of the animal groups, the vertebrates and the invertebrates. And then to, let's see here. Let me get back to my slide that shows this. I lost it. But basically, Mr. Royce's assertion that all the animal phyla appeared during the Cambrian explosion is actually false. Most of the major animal groups that we see today emerged after the Cambrian explosion, and prior to the Cambrian explosion, we still have fossils that we're finding that show burrows and tracks. So it's not as dramatic as was initially represented by Stephen Jay Gould in Wonderful Life.
Please go ahead and ask your question.
This is directed at Mr. Royce. It appeared that your mathematical arguments were actually directed more towards abiogenesis rather than evolution. So how would you explain with math any evidence for intelligent design for the actual process of evolution rather than abiogenesis, which is a separate topic altogether?
Yeah, I addressed abiogenesis first, the leap from non-life to life, just because I think that just comes first chronologically. But if you grant the existence of a reproducing cell, then next you do have to go to something like, for example, the bacterial flagellum, and you can look at similar mathematical arguments. The same idea is that if you want additional function in an organism, just like if you want more features in a protein factory, you need, if it's an automated protein factory, you need someone to write the code, because it's the only known source of coded language where each symbol actually has meaning is the mind. And so the same mathematics of the biogenesis also applies to calculating the probability that the bacterial flagellar rotary motor arrived accidentally. So the basic idea is that you need to have a boundary, and the boundary from Dembski is 10 to the 150th. If it would take more than 10 to the 150th attempts to, by chance, generate the flagellar motor, then the same mathematics applies, and you would have to do what Darwin said we should do, and that is, if you can find an organism that could not possibly have appeared by slight successive changes, then my theory would absolutely break down. And so that 10 to the 150th is just a number that reinforces the idea that Darwin himself said that you'd have to look for in order to reject evolution.
Mr. Erdmann, would you like to respond?
Sure.
This was another slide I wasn't able to talk about till now, but the bacterial flagellum is an intelligent design icon. It's a very complex structure. It has multiple moving parts. It's very elegant when you watch it work. And the idea is, at least on the intelligent design side, is that if you take away any one of these parts, then this particular piece of machinery won't work at all. So how can you evolve a structure that's made of all these component parts? Any particular part at any given time is not there, it won't work. Well, the misconception is that every bacterium has exactly the same flagellum, and that's not true. As we look at this chart here, we see that in different types of bacteria, they're actually missing many different parts, and the bacterial flagellum works just fine. So the idea that evolution can't produce new parts de novo from a new source is absolutely right. What happens is old parts get modified in new ways. Old parts may be removed. Old parts may be altered into new parts to work with parts that were already there, and you still are going to have functionality.
Person on this side.
Mr. Royce, I'd like to address a similar question as the previous questioner did. Now, you tried to make the argument using hypothesis testing, with the null hypothesis being that everything happened by chance or evolution, and the alternative hypothesis being that an intelligent designer clearly exists. Now, as any hypothesis testing would occur, we know that an error could occur, particularly a type 1 error where we incorrectly reject the null hypothesis and claim that in fact there is an intelligent designer when in fact there isn't. How do we know from the evidence that we have at hand that the probability of making such an error is so insignificant that we can make such a claim using hypothesis testing?
Thank you for that question. It is true that hypothesis testing does not pretend to arrive at knowledge, but rather, if you reject the chance law hypothesis, you say there is sufficient evidence. It's a scary thing about being a scientist, is that you are giving numbers permission to affect what you believe. And some people are so committed to they have prior commitments to philosophies that they're just not even willing to say, well, there is sufficient evidence for an unseen intelligent agent. They're saying, I'm not even going to let that other basketball team enter the arena. We're not even going to look at it. So you're right, it's not knowledge beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it is knowledge beyond a reasonable doubt.
Mr. Erdmann has the option to respond.
No thanks.
All right, my question is for Mr. Royce. And this was, I just noticed at the beginning of your speech, you had your analogy about a house catching fire or a plane flying into a building, where you say that those were evidence of an unseen intelligent agent. The problem that I picked up on that I think exists with that analogy is that we know of an intelligent agent for those things. Humans can light fires, humans can fly planes into buildings, but in the context of the origin of life, you seem to be assuming that we know of some intelligent agent that could create life. And if I may offer a counter analogy, say that some guy's car gets hit by 5 meteors over the course of however long he owns the car. We wouldn't walk up to that guy and say, there must be some sort of intelligence up there that we don't know about that just hates you and throws meteors at the car and is capable of throwing meteors at your car. And these are actual space meteors. You have them analyzed to show that they're actually real space meteors. And we would walk up to that guy and say, darn, this guy's really unlucky. We wouldn't say that there's some intelligent agent, because that would presuppose that there is an intelligent agent capable of doing that. And I think that was the disconnect in your analogy between houses catching fire and life coming about. Okay, do you think that's a problem?
What was the very last comment? I just didn't hear the very last thing you said.
Do you think that is do you think that that analogy is flawed for that reason that I presented?
No. But I actually have more to say instead of banking the rest of my time. There's a scientific organization that was actually recently defunded, SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and there's a movie Contact, about the sorts of things that could happen with SETI. It is an actual scientific outfit. What they do is they look for patterns in radio signals coming from outer space. Now, we have no reason to believe that aliens actually exist. Our philosophy might say that they do, but in the movie they get not only prime numbers, but also digitally coded blueprints for building a very sophisticated machine. And so, as soon as they get the blueprints for a working machine, they conclude, okay, well, obviously there's some intelligence out there, even though we've never seen an alien. What if an alien shows up? What happens? We say, hey, if I said, hey, I'm from Vega, you'd be like, well, nice costume. And yet, that scene is not believing, but when you see a specification, and 5 meteorites on one car may in fact be reason to be suspicious about what really is going on. But in the movie Contact, it's like, okay, if blueprints for building a sophisticated machine means there's an unseen intelligent agent, then what if we were to metaphorically take those radio telescopes and point them at our DNA, which can be viewed as blueprints for building a sophisticated machine? Why is it that we don't come to the same conclusion? If we don't, then perhaps we're not being fully intellectually honest.
I guess am I allowed to ask Mr. Royce a question?
No. That could be interesting.
Yes, if it becomes a problem.
I am not opposed to that.
And then you can ask me one too. Throughout this evening, you've been arguing that there are examples, according to you, of clear evidence of design. But I think you've also told me in the past that you agree in the principle that there may be change within a type over time. So can you clarify, where does design enter the equation, and where does microevolution, as you would call it, enter the equation?
Yeah, I mean, I fully acknowledge that microevolution occurs. You can use microevolution to understand the dynamics between bacteria and antibiotics, in particular between malaria and chloroquine and quinine. So, I mean, but the mathematics indicate, at least the mathematics of Michael Behe in his book, The Edge of Evolution, indicates that there are real limits to what evolution can accomplish. And in fact, the microevolution that malaria undergo to get past quinine is actually, it weakens the organism. And so, I mean, I see, it's intelligent design when you actually have a probability that's low enough to reject the null hypothesis. We have really departed from the format here. But
I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's mostly my fault.
Before Mr. Royce can ask ask Mr. Erdmann a question. Please go ahead with your question.
This is for Mr. Erdmann.
Yes.
So it's easy to see how once you have an organism to evolve from, that the whole branches can evolve and after slight genetic mutations. But it's harder to understand where the first coding comes from, the first DNA. So can you explain to us how cells, how evolutionists think cells form DNA that coded for the specific proteins?
No. Oh, let me clarify that question. I think I surprised some people out there. When you look at prebiotic evolution, it's really kind of a guessing game, and you're really taking a look at the probabilities that certain monomers will come together to go ahead and make polymers. And then those polymers will then have some sort of functionality to build, basically catabolism. So I think the example I gave you with the Gadiri peptide is kind of a nice example. We do know that monomers do spontaneously assemble into larger molecules, and we can envision a process by where you'll have polymers being created that will fit other compounds slightly better than other polymers will, to the point where you may actually have a functional active site that will actually work in a biochemical pathway. Now, in terms of the research that's supporting all that right now, that's still in progress. So I'm completely willing to admit where we have really, really strong evidence and where the evidence is not as strong and they're still working on it. So prebiotic evolution, I tell my classes this as well, the evidence isn't really strong for the exact pathway for how that's worked out. There's some hypotheses that state that it began as an RNA world, that you had RNA that was able to auto-catalyze, make larger RNAs, which then were able to act as enzymes and build, and then you were able to get proteins. Well, there's a number of other equally valid hypotheses as well. So that is a part of evolutionary theory that needs some work, those firsts. But I like to start with the very first cell and move from there, because I think we do have very strong evidence from that first cell to modern day multicellular life.
Mr. Royce, would you like to respond?
Yes, please. The feature about the question I really like is that it points out that there's some catch-22s in the origin of the first reproducing cell. In a protein factory, a lot of the work is done by proteins, and the only way to make the machines that make the proteins is with the DNA that codes for the proteins that make the proteins. It's the calculations that I showed you today for just getting 250 proteins together that are functional, that was just the hardware. We weren't even looking at the software. That's one of the great weaknesses for someone who wants to take biology outside of that narrow interval from where life begins to where we are now. If you want to take it outside of that, then you need to be aware that biology has a big problem. There is no testable mechanism for the origin of digital code, of coded information, the DNA. So right now, there's not even a testable theory to go with.
Next on the side.
This is for Mr. Royce. Hi.
Hi.
Who do you believe is the intelligent designer?
Thank you for asking. The thing about intelligent design is that it's a lot like the relationship that intelligent design scientists have with philosophers and theologians is similar to the relationship that a forensic scientist has with a police detective. The forensic scientist says, we have the specifications that indicate there was an intelligent design, so a murder or suicide, but the intelligent design scientist does not, identify the designer of the death. Instead, they pass the baton on to the police detective. In the same way, intelligent design scientists if they determine that life is a product of intelligent design, they then pass the baton off to the philosophers and theologians, and they can then decide, okay, now what's the identity? So the question about who is the designer, it's off topic for this particular debate, but I mean, in terms of my personal view, I'd be happy to talk with you privately about that. I mean, I have no problem. It's just off topic for this debate, because that's not what intelligent design does. It does not identify the characteristics of the designer. Sure. Thank you.
Mr. Erdmann, would you like to respond?
Yes, and can you put up a slide, please? Actually, I disagree with Mr. Royce. All intelligent design proponents know exactly who the designer is. It's a Christian God, and what I'm showing you here is a document that was leaked by an organization called the Discovery Institute. And you'll notice that the acronym for Discovery Institute is ID backwards, you know, kind of clever. But you'll notice that this wedge document lays out two main purposes for the Discovery Institute. And all the major scientists that Mr. Royce has talked about this evening, Behe, Dembski, Jonathan Wells, Stephen Meyer, they all belong to this think tank that's funded by fundamentalist Christian organizations and the Southern Baptist Church. And you'll notice in these 2 bullet points, nowhere does it say, let's do good science. Here's what it says. Our goals are to, number 1, defeat scientific materialism and its destructive moral, cultural, and political legacies. And number 2, to replace materialistic explanations with a theistic understanding that nature and human beings are created by God. So don't follow this line of reasoning that intelligent design proponents are just saying there's some intelligence and we don't really know what it is. It could be aliens. We're not talking aliens, boys and girls. There's a definitive push here to push this theological agenda. Thank you.
Next up, we have Vincent Fiorentini with a question.
This question comes from Ben Rosenberg and me. It's a question from Mr. Erdmann about something Mr. Royce has said. If I understand your argument, Mr. Royce, correctly, you briefly mentioned about information, about how the alphabet, so to speak, either literally with humans or by analogy with DNA, nucleotides, and all that. I believe you said that that information, if it carries intrinsic meaning for each symbol, for each character, if that's the case, then it has to have come from some intelligent designer. There's some connection between design and associated, not arbitrary value with information.
The existence of coded language, yes, that's right.
Coded language, yes.
Yeah.
So my question for Mr. Erdmann is, how would you refute that? Is there any argument in evolution to explain how information could somehow be carried on without an intelligent designer?
Okay, excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. Dr. Thomas Schneider, sorry, my phone's buzzing here. Dr. Schneider of the National Institutes of Health created a computer program called EV. And what EV did, was programmed to do was generate a random sequence of 256 bases, A, T, C, and G, completely random sequences of these letters. And then these letters code for protein recognition, a binding site. And so what happened was he set up the program so that these would just be generated randomly, and the half that bound the best to this designated site would reproduce in the next generation, again with random mutations. And 3 factors actually increase the information: replication, mutation, and selection, natural selection. So the information in this computer program actually came from the environment, because at time 0, at the beginning, the information content was 0. So if you take a look at this graph, over time, with selection, we see an increase in information in terms of bits per site. When the selective process was removed, what happened was this went right back to 0 information content. That's it. I'm done.
Mr. Royce, would you like the chance to respond?
Yes, please. Just a couple of quick observations. It's very common to try to drive the car before you get a license. And the motor of natural selection really is out of bounds. That car cannot be used until you actually have reproduction. So something like this, to actually refer to natural selection, which assumes that you already have information in a reproducing cell, it's actually out of bounds to use that. Because we're trying to answer the question of where did the information come from in the first place, not how can the information change once it's obtained. Thank you.